Chapter 40. The Men. Belderon walked on the strange continent in the dark of night. Snow fell relentlessly. He was surrounded by a vast wilderness of mystery and ice. The circumstances could have produced in Belderon an overwhelming terror at his isolation. With the mountains behind him and the treacherous sea before him, he could have felt himself helpless and utterly alone. Except that he knew he wasn't. He knew in his very bones that he was on the way to his heart's home. His brow was furrowed, and he stared ahead into the darkness. He was walking in the footsteps of Thervius, and it was the very valley they had ascended together from the beach after they first arrived on this continent. This towering, lonely valley was a place they had shared together. This memory made it full of belonging. To Belderon, it was saturated with assurance. He half ran, half walked, letting gravity pull him down toward the beach. He no longer needed to follow the tracks. He knew where he was, and he knew where Thervius was going. Belderon's coat swung heavily around him, still filled with the golden fish. The rolled-up furs tied around his waist bounced lightly. The roar of the ocean grew louder, and the snow stopped falling. The bare moon cast everything in a silver glow. Soon Belderon could see the white caps of the waves and the snowbank that met the ocean's edge. He quickened his pace and was soon on the wide, snow-covered beach. He immediately turned and ran up toward the boat, which from a distance and in the moonlight looked like a bleached bone. Now Belderon began to run. As he drew closer, he saw a pair of feet swung over the edge. A rush of agony, a rush of desire. What was strangling his heart? Something in him wanted to suddenly die. The rest wanted to soar into his own promised life. Belderon's chest burned in mysterious confusion. His eyes stayed fixed on the boat, on the feet, until finally his legs brought him to the edge, and he peered down into the silvery gray face of Thervius. It was almost like he was made of granite. His eyes were closed, his face dreamy and still, utterly still. Belderon's eyes flashed down from Thervius to the arm thrown over another who was sleeping. A roar, a deep churning issued forth from within Belderon. Both hands gripped the boat and pushed it up, tipping both men out the other side. He roared again and then screamed, "Thervius!" There was no answer. Belderon let go of the boat and it tipped back, upending the last of Thervius over the edge. The boat rocked briefly in the snow and then quickly returned to motionlessness. Belderon was filled with alarm. The men, he realized, were unconscious. He ran around the other side and saw them thrown over like corpses. A sob rushed through Belderon. He knelt down and felt Thervius's face, which was cold, deathly cold. Belderon instinctively reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of fish. He opened Thervius's cold jaw and pushed the food into his mouth. Belderon immediately felt the warmth around Thervius's cheeks, but Thervius did not stir. Belderon pushed more fish in, massaging his throat to induce Thervius to swallow. Then Belderon turned around to the unknown dark-haired man. He felt for a pulse at his neck. It was slow and faint. Belderon opened the man's jaw and pushed more fish in. He turned back to Thervius and did the same, then back to the unknown man. Belderon jumped up and untied the furs from his waist. He spread out one at one end of the boat and the other at the other end. Then he turned and hoisted Thervius up over the edge of the boat. He laid him out over the fur and wrapped him tightly. Belderon gazed over at the unknown man and paused. Then he knelt down and hoisted him into the boat too. He wrapped him in the furs. Then he sat back in the middle of the boat between the two men. Thervius began to stir. Belderon jumped around and enfolded Thervius in his arms. his heart spilling over in relief. Thervius, Thervius, he called. Belderon, Thervius gasped weakly. You are here. I knew you would be here. Belderon's heart clung to these words. Thervius was alive. Thervius, Belderon was understanding, was alive. Belderon held Thervius and remained choked in overwhelming and unnameable emotions. He gave Thervius more fish, who seemed to quickly be regaining strength. He clutched Belderon more tightly. I love you, Belderon. I love you. I love you. Belderon couldn't find his words. He was stunned with love. To speak it would be to separate himself from it. It was all he was. Thervius tried to sit up suddenly. Janku? Is Janku all right? Belderon froze. Is that him? He pointed to the other end of the boat. Janku was not awake, but was now snoring in a deep slumber. Thervius fell back, assured, yes, and then he turned back to Belderon. Belderon, that's my brother. He found me. I don't know how, but he just appeared, with nothing, not even his clothes. Belderon collapsed more deeply into his lover's arms. He had lost his ability to speak once again. I don't know how anything happened, Belderon, Thervius continued. How we got separated, or even how I made it here alive. My clothes were burned off a long time ago. I don't know. I don't know. Belderon simply held Thervius tighter. The moon poured over them all the rest of the night. Chapter 41. Marriage. Sophia and Marcus stood in the morning light holding hands. The heartlight glowed softly around them. Off in the distance, someone played a flute. Newly built cabins beamed from behind them with freshly carved posts. The couple stood with Cleo, Lydia, Daria, and Elwyn. Lydia and Daria were returning to their home. Sophia had found a new one. Cleo would return with Elwyn, with more food for the winter. The group had just finished their morning prayers. Tell the rest of the temple we will visit next spring, Sophia said. I will, said Daria. We will miss you. All the women hugged. Sophia closed her eyes with her arms around them all. When she opened them, she was startled. Coming down the trail were 3 men. Each one glowed with a golden light, and a perfect heart light encircled 2 of them. Marcus, Sophia gasped, realization creeping through her. Marcus, they've returned. Marcus stared down the trail in disbelief. At first he didn't recognize any of them. Then, as they grew closer, he saw the confident gait of Belderon and the blonde, curly hair of Thervius, who held the fur about him. So did the other man, whom Marcus didn't recognize at all, but the priestesses did. Janku, they each exclaimed, and then fell into weeping. You're alive! Janku ran forward and embraced the women, who cried and sobbed and laughed over the redeemed young man. Thervius ran up and hugged them too, receiving congratulations and bewilderment over his heart light. Belderon stepped forward to Marcus, and the 2 embraced. The young man stepped back into the honest gaze of his chieftain, who marveled at the new maturity and wisdom that hung around the young Belderon. Marcus wondered at the golden light. Marcus, Belderon said, I've been face to face with wide veins of jewels, and my pockets have been full of enchanted food. But now I have nothing. We have failed to bring back a blessing. Marcus laughed respectfully and slowly shook his head. We are blessed, Belderon. The blessing has come. Welcome home. Elwyn and the priestesses delayed their journey for one more day. This gave the 3 young men a chance to tell the villagers their story, and then for the priestesses to counsel the brothers on the full story of the demon. Then Belderon, Thervius, and Janku joined the travelers to the southern coast. There, the three men continued the work of restoring the farm at the edge of the ocean. Chapter 42. Welfram. The continued polyphonic music of the rocks was having its effect on the Welfram. Their sense of duty to the stones was becoming interspersed with other characteristics. Some were starting to fly further away from the stones, turning somersaults in the air and moving to the new music. Their dancing caused aberrations in the way the sunlight fell upon the earth, so new species of flowers began to emerge, such as the pale pink daisy and the blue and white lily. Some Wolfram, inspired by the trip of the family to the far eastern southern coast, began to explore other shores. Many stayed in the faraway lands, populating them for the first time with fairy life. The first family who had left the shores of Gren Amar chose never again to leave. Instead, they became guardians of the new forest of Arctic cypress that grew up around the original mother tree. They felt they owed it to the trees to help them along. The end.